Welcome to returning a value from a method. We will review instances where we get to return a value from a method, and we'll also look at the void methods. Like we'll have not really a deep dive, but a sequential review of what happens when we're working with a method that has the void data type. So because we're going to discuss those things, let me start by reminding us there was a previous session where we reviewed the defining of our methods and method declarations. So we looked at the bits and pieces, and I'll append the card to that session so you can just go and review it if you missed it. Now, having this in mind, we are going to review in this session when a method returns to the code that invoked it. So there are several instances. The first instance being when it completes all the statements within it. I'll take us to IntelliJ to show us this. Instance 1. When a method completes all the statements within it, it returns to the code that invoked it. Now in Java, we talked about the very beginning of our sessions, how the main method is the entry point to our code. So given that, then we start with this first statement here. The entry point, the first statement is an object. We are creating an object by the identity, or rather the reference test, or let's just call it a variable name test. Then we get to create the method from this class. So we're within the class return value from method, and in its main method, we are creating an object from that class. Then we use that object to access, or rather to invoke a method next. So we are invoking the method completes all statement. When that happens, the compiler will go to that method that has been invoked, and it will walk through the statements one by one of that method. So we would expect in our display to see statement 1, statement 2, statement 3. Another thing I need to mention is you can include a return statement in your method like this, but it is redundant, like it's even grayed out. However, when we move forward with our discussion to discussing for loops and so on, we'll see how sometimes a return statement could be useful. The if and else branch statements and so on. Okay, so if I would attempt to return a value from a method that has been marked as void, then I'll see a compile time error. It's not allowed for you to return a value or a particular data type from a method whose declaration is void. So I'll just undo that. And then we'll go back to the method. So what will happen is once this statement, we get to this statement right here, statement 3, which is our final statement. Let me just say last statement. Once the method gets to the last statement, it returns back to the code that invoked it. So it returns back here. So what we would expect after statement 1, statement 2, and last statement is to see continues after invoking completes all statements. Yeah, so continues after invoked completes all statements returns to this code, which is the code that invoked it. Then moving to the next one, so it happens sequentially. Next, we have returns value being invoked, and returns value expects 2 arguments of type int, 5 and 2. So what will happen then, it will go to returns value. Please ignore, we're just focusing on the understanding the concepts. So I ask us all to ignore the errors. For now, we're just focusing on understanding the basic concepts. Later on, we'll work with data code once all the concepts are in shape. Okay, so returns value has been invoked. Then we go into returns value. It's expecting 2 integer arguments because it has 2 parameters of type int. It has a return type int. So when a method has a return type, then within its body, you must include a return statement. If you don't do that, you'll see a compile time error. So I'll just return my return statement, and that return statement should be of the same type as the data type in the declaration. So we expect x and y to be int, and that is why it is allowed. If I was to try and use another type here, like for example, a string, then you'll see an error. It should let me know that the return type is int. Therefore, I either need to change it to string and so on and so forth, or adjust this one. So I'll just take it back to the way it was, x plus y. So if it has a return type, it is expecting a return value. And that is the next scenario to when a method goes back to the code that invoked it. So when it reaches a return statement, when it reaches a return statement, it goes back to the code that invoked it. So in this method, it will go back to, given that it has reached the return statement here, very typical for methods with return with data types as part of their declaration, then it will go back here. So we expect to see before return statement. Okay, then the return statement, then it goes back to the code that invoked it, and then after that we'll see continues. After invoked returns a value, returns to this code. So I'll just run that so we can see all of them come alive. There you go, statement 1, statement 2, last statement, then it goes to continues after completes all statement, returns to the code that invoked it. Then it goes to before statement, when we invoke this, returns a value. I just included that so we can see before return statement. Then after it gets to the return statement, it goes back to the code that invoked it here. Then it finishes with continues after invoked, returns a value, returns to the code, and the process is finished. But there's another instance where a method returns to the code that invokes it. So if you're coming from a different programming language, you might we call this a method is called, invoked and called sometimes are used to mean the same thing. So another instance is when it throws an exception. We'll cover exceptions later. I'd already mentioned this when I was walking us through method declaration. So sometimes we have exceptions in the method. So sometimes when it reaches an exception statement, it returns to the code that invoked it, and we'll see what that is. For now, this is the syntax of a return statement, return keyword, and then the value. And this value needs to have the same data type as that in the method declaration. Like in our case, it was int. In our case, it was int. Okay, so just so you know, a method return type can be a reference type. For example, in this method, the return type is database. And in this case, database is the reference type as you would use it when you're creating an object. And the method name is best database. And it's accepting, this method is accepting, it's expecting 2 arguments of the type database each, and by the parameter names are Oracle and Postgres. And within the method, then it would expect you to return a value of the same type as the return type. So, for example, return Postgres. When we get along in our course, we'll see how we can make this kind of functionality come alive. But for now, I'll leave it at that.